Hello. In the past videos, I looked at bishop d7 and knight bd7 when white got a good advantage with e5. And in this video, I'd like to look at the main line with knight fd7 and a4. White could try knight f3 instead, but I think this gives black a comfortable game after a6 and b5. So with a4, we're actively preventing black's queenside play with a6 and b5. So usually black will castle here, but there's also some weird theory with queen h4 check, which I don't think is as critical. White's goal is to play e5, and black's goal is to untangle the queenside and prevent e5. So the most common for that is after knight f3, black will play knight a6, with the idea of activating the knight to either c7 or b4. I'm going to cover for knight c7 separately, as I'm going to recommend this move f5, which is totally different character than the lines after knight b4. Here the moves rook e1 and bishop e3 are both good, but I think rook e1 is much more natural, so that's what I'm going to recommend. Here white has to be careful. After a6, if very natural, bishop c4, black can equalize immediately with knight b6, the bishop moves again, and bishop g4. By eliminating the knight, black will get a very strong control over the dark squares in the center, maybe landing a bishop on g4, and also the white queen is tied to protect against the fork on c2. So now going back, we see why after a6 we should play bishop f1, and not a more active move, because now after something like knight f6, we have time to play h3, stopping the very active bishop g4. And now after black develops with like rook e8, we can put the bishop back on c4 where it belongs. It protects d5, so after like e5, we've got an extra defender of d5, and in some lines, the pawn can go all the way, and we try to smash the diagonal open for the bishop. Although black has many legal moves, against almost all of them, white's plan is the same, to crash through with e5. So the most common move on lichess, and very natural, is to play knight d7, stopping e5 by adding two more defenders of that square. And here we see another idea of the Taimanov, where white will reposition the bishop to h4. And so here, white is actually ready to play e5 if he really wants to, because after taking bishop g3, we see that the pawn is pinned to the rook. But white actually has a stronger move, and that is queen d2, with the idea that now, say black plays normally, white wants to crash through with e5, and then if black takes it, we can bring another rook in the game. So, for example, queen e5 here is met with rook e1, which is not possible before. There's just some cool tactics here, like if rook e5, white has a very nice bishop g3, with the idea that we can sack the bishop because this leads to mate. And if queen d6, protecting the bishop, we have knight e4, and white wins. So that was all after knight d7. Very natural to stop e5, but white can maneuver with the bishop and get a very strong attack. But now look at the second most popular move, rook b8, which allows white to play e5. And very funnily here, de is actually a terrible move because white gets extra scope for the bishop. So for example, we take back, he goes here, and bishop g5, and the queen has no good squares to go to. For example, if it goes to c7, then e6, knight moves, and d6, and we see that the queen is attacked, and white has huge threats against the f-pawn, and white wins. Very similarly, on queen b6, play a5, forcing the queen to either c7 or a7, which are both terrible squares. And on queen a5, we can play e6, when black has to take us, because if he goes knight b6, he actually gets checkmated. We can take, then take the rook, and follow up with queen e1 check, and the black king dies. And so instead of that, black has to take us, and here after knight b6, we have the very nice bishop d8, with a very strong pin against the queen, and white wins. So that was after rook b8, e5, and black taking us. Instead of that, much better is knight d7, when we play e6. And here black has to play knight b6, hitting the bishop. If he gives us a free tempo with knight f6, we can actually throw an f5, amazing, and bishop f4. The point of this move is to not only attack the d-pawn, but also pin it to the rook behind it. So that now, for example, after fe6, the rook hangs. We can't take it right away, so first we just take on d5. The bishop's the strongest piece on the board. We don't want to give that up. Taking, and then we take the rook. And white's winning here. So black shouldn't take on e6. And I think it's kind of cool that a move like knight h5 is crushed by knight g5, with the queen hitting h5 and the e takes f7 threat. So the best move for black here is actually to just totally get out of this pin with rook a8, when white can play taking an f7, and the very nice rook e6, with the point that bishop takes e6, we take back. Of course, king g8 is met by e7 check, winning the queen. So king e7 also protects d6, which is nice. And now knight h4 is very strong, with the knight f5 threat coming, and black's toast. For example, d5, it's really black's only try to escape. We can take it, play e7, and bishop d6, and white wins. So now going back, we see that after knight f6, f5 is a very strong move. So instead of that, black should play knight b6 to try to maintain the balance. And on lead chess, strong players have played taking on f7, but this actually lets black free himself. I wouldn't play this. I would play bishop e3, keeping the tension, when white can retain some advantage. White has several threats, like a5 and f5, so black should act quickly, taking and playing c4, trying to win the e6 pawn. White should play precisely here with a5, and of course if the knight moves, we can just take on c4. So black has to play sharply with bishop e6. We go knight g5, bishop f7, and we take the bishop. Because this b4 knight is unprotected, taking back with the king actually loses for black. So we could take the rook, take this knight, and if they take us, we have this nice check with the fork, winning the piece. So black is forced to give us this intermezzo on e1 with check. When we take back, they take us, and now we have the shots begin with knight e4. So this threatens knight g5 and to take on b4. And also b6 is hanging. So it's kind of a crazy position. To show the idea is that if he takes the bishop, check, check, winning the queen with mate to follow. So black has only one good move here to try to escape. That's knight d3. We go queen e3 and h6 to stop knight g5. So we take on b6, and the c4 pawn is defending the knight and attacking the bishop. So taking the bishop is not possible because we just take the knight. Black's got a piece here, and he has to play very precisely to get the piece back. And even if he does, white keeps a good initiative. I've analyzed the lines in a lot of depth, but I don't just want to show like random analysis. So the points are that if like knight c1, rook c1, the rook could come to c7, which is very strong. If ever black takes on b3, queen comes to b3, which is also very strong. And also that the knight can come to c5 in a lot of variations. That's all after a rook b8, e5, knight d7, e6. Only move is knight b6. When we keep the tension with bishop b3, black will try to win the e-pawn with taking, and c4, when we have the very strong a5. That's what to do against the most popular moves in this position, knight d7 and rook b8. Now I'd like to go back and look at what I think the most critical option for black is, because I think white gets a very pleasant advantage in all of these lines. So here, I think the most critical move is rook e8. And black doesn't even want to play knight f6. Black would like to play f5. In principle, I think this makes a lot of sense, and that's why it's the best choice for black. Black is going to suffer all game due to a space disadvantage, so we'd like to open some files, trade some pieces, and never allow white the very strong e5 break. So against rook e8, we still play h3. That's still, we still don't want bishop g4 to happen, and now black plays f5. After f5, bishop d2 and queen b3 should transpose back to each other, but I think bishop g2 is more natural, so that's what I'm going to recommend. Here black should take on e4. Instead knight f6, white gets a huge attack with e5. And it's not worth running through all the lines, but just a couple. So like if knight d7, knight g5 is very strong. If black takes on e5, takes on d5, bishop g5 is an awesome move that wins. Because if the queen moves, bishop c4, and now black doesn't have bishop e6 to defend the knight, and white will pick up the knight. And if instead knight takes c3, counterattacking white's queen, we can take on d8, and then take back on c3 when white wins because both of these pieces are attacked. Now going back to where e5 was played, we just looked at taking with a pawn and then taking. And if they just take right away, we can take and play bishop c4. And of course, bishop e6 is met with knight g5. And for knight f4, white has to be a little careful to win the piece, but he does with taking d6, opening up the rook on e6, and after black defends it, bishop c3, and white should win the game. For example, if like queen c6, queen b3, and white will win, like king f7 defending the knight again. Some nice tactics here with taking and queen b7. If queen b6 to stop queen b3, white has the very clean queen d7. And finally, if black takes on d1, we can take back. Now black should take on c3 to avoid any like king f7 being overloaded defending both things. We take back, king f7, and now we win with rook d6. So yeah, we see that knight f6 is not very good because of e5. So black should first take on e4. And now we don't have e5, play knight f6. And of course, like bishop b2, we just hit the bishop and then take on d6 with the knight, then white's crushing. Going back to knight f6. This move hits the pawn, so we should take it, play queen b3. And this is why I said earlier that the two moves transpose, because if we played queen b3 first, here we play bishop d2. Here black has kind of a big choice. He can go bishop f5 first, or he can take and then go bishop f5. So I think more popular is to take and then go bishop f5. This point of the game, white doesn't really feel like he's going to be checkmated, so he played g4, get some space for the endgame to come. The best move is bishop d7. Also interesting is bishop c2, when we go queen e3 to maintain the control over the e-file, and black can go pawn grabbing with bishop a4, queen e6, king h8, bishop c3, black has to take, and queen f8. We can't just take on b4 because of rook e8, which would win for black. So instead, we just play knight g5, rook e8, queen f7, trading some pieces, take, and a little bit of a forcing line here. Both these pieces are attacked, but black is fine because taking, and we see that black has two pieces for a bishop, and white is slightly better, but maybe it's difficult to convert this in practice. So instead of bishop c2, better is bishop d7, and I spent a lot of time here trying to come up with an advantage for white, but I think black equalizes, even though white gets a lot of pressure for the rest of the game. Yeah, and while making the video, I noticed that there's a chessable course that actually reaches this position, and it covers knight g5 and bishop c3. So, of course, I'm an engine jockey, so I found some other move, king h2, queen a5, and I'll just run through one line of analysis. Bishop c3, rook f8 defending the bishop, taking, queen c3. Black has to be a little careful. He can still lose very quickly, like rook f4, rook e7 is lights out, and if rook f7, knight g5, white has a huge attack. Like white's crushing black here. So black's best move is not to move the rook, but just to defend the rook with the queen. And there's like a million moves in all these positions. I'd recommend you to take a look at this yourself. It's a very rich endgame. It's very enjoyable to study. But I'm just going to run through one sample line here. So queen d2 to defend f4, black takes on a4, bishop g2. And it's really not a big deal to be down a pawn on these positions, because white's pieces are much better than black's, and we'll win the d6 pawn back eventually. So h6, g5, taking, bishop d7, knight e4, and we get the pawn back. And now there's several moves for black. Queen h4, rook f1, take on b7, move the rook. In these positions, this is a sort of very common scenario where black will take the f4 pawn with the queen, and in the process white trades the queens. White will get very strong piece play, but just because of such a reduced material on the board, he'll be unable to win. I'll just show, again, like, continue the line. So like rook b6, and I just want to push the pawn all the way. The rook was attacked. So rook b8, bishop f3, push the pawn, take the knight, push the pawn, he takes us, we take, and now he can't take us with queen, he has to block us. We just improve the king. There's no way to win this position, it's a draw, but I think we can put black under a good amount of pressure. But if here he finds rook d2, white could run the risk of being the one worse now, because black's pawn could be running up the board. So I just liquidate the pawns, and yeah, this is a draw. There are a million moves to draw, but if black plays c4, we may be under a little bit of pressure, you think, but b5, and I just want to get behind your pawn, and this is a draw. So we just looked at some possibilities after rook takes e1, and now I'd like to look at the other option, which is bishop f5. I think it's a little worse for black. We get a take, and take the knight, put a rook on the e-file, take on b4. And we're just going to play around for a long time in these positions. It's a very stable edge. g4 again, and queen e6. And this is where this position gets interesting. In practical play, I think white should have a huge advantage here, but the engine finds ways for black to hold all the time. Queen e6 is forced. Now we have a very strong passed e-pawn. Black tries to get activity with the rook, and white's plan is to make a second passed pawn, connected passed pawns with the f5 pawn break. White plays a very useful move of knight g5, hitting h7, which is very important in a lot of lines, so knight's just very active here. And black can play king f8, that leads to some interesting lines. But I mean, I could show tons of alternatives everywhere, so I'll just show this one sample line. Bishop f6, stopping e7 directly, king g2, d5, h4, bishop e7, Rook b1 hits the pawn, comes back at the d pawn, rook c5, king f3. Both sides just improved their pieces. b5, and now f5. And from this point onwards, black has to play only moves to survive the game. His king side's under a ton of pressure. So he takes. And white's goal is very simple, just push the pawns. Here white's running f6 with check, so black has to stop that by playing bishop c3, king d6, and they have to come back, only move. White has a couple moves here. I like king d7, and now rook b5 is the only move. For example, like rook c2, e7 wins, h6, we want to push the pawn, and we're going to queen. Be careful not to play f7, it's not very clear. Like black's going to try to stop our pawns. Not as clear. Rook b5, only move to play rook b7 check. Rook f1, king f6, allowing it to take, but it's still the only move. King e5 again, only move. King g7 allows f6, and we win. Same way as before. And we're in time to stop all the pawns. King e5 is the only move. But black is kind of forced to do this. We have a3, white's just going to push h5, and the black king can never come to help, because as soon as it goes king g7, we play f6 with check, and white wins. So taking, bishop h5, bishop f8. It's very nice, just stopping the pawn. And we'd like to make black suffer in rook versus bishop, but we don't want to have to sack our rook for any of these pawns. So the best is just to run the king back and try to eat the black pawns. Rook f3 is nice to stop a3. Bishop f8 is the only move. For example, like d4. And white gets to keep the h5 pawn alive, meaning that black will suffer for a long time. But with bishop f8, black really wants to play a3. So we should play king c6, trying to round up the black pawns. He does what he's supposed to do. a3, rook f2, bishop g7 now. Now f6 is very important to stop bishop b2. So now the bishop is pinned and unpinning. And we just run the king back to stop the black pawns, which could become dangerous. And here black runs up the h5 pawn, and I tried to make this apply a little pressure, but this is kind of a dead draw. And that all came out of the move f5, where black forces white into a slightly better ending. I hope this was helpful in showing some theory of the Taimanov attack, get a better understanding of it, the lines after knight b4. At some point, I'd like to show knight c7 and queen h4. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.